Okay, we're live.
Pawb. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the finance panel. This afternoon, we're looking at the budgets for the next financial year. We've got a few councillors here, but we've also got the Deputy Leader of the Council, Councillor Matthew. Welcome, Matthew. And also Portfolio Holder for Finance, Councillor David Thomas. So thank you both. And we've got, as well, a very important person within the council, I was going to say the Section 151 officer, Jane Thomas, who makes sure that the budget set is legal. In addition to our usual panel members, we've got the Chair of Audit, Lynn Hamilton, and one of the other members of the Audit Committee, John Broughtingham. Of course, Gareth Hall, the other independent member, is a regular finance panel member. So welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. First item on the agenda is apologies. I know we've got one from Pete Lewington.
Pete Lewington, that's the only one, Chair.
And at the moment, Jeremy Pugh and Tom Colbert, haven't quite joined us yet. So hopefully they will later on. Item 2, disclosures of interest. I'm not sure if anybody's got any at the moment, but if you think of something as we go along, I'm sure you will bring our attention to that. Then item 3 is the disclosure of party whips. I assume by your silence, nothing to disclose. And then item 4, the budget itself. I'm going to invite Councillor David Thomas, Finance Portfolio Holder, to give us a high-level overview of the budget, and to be followed by Jane Thomas, the Section 151 or the County Treasurer, to also give her high-level summary of the budget. So Councillor David, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just give a brief introduction to the draft revenue budget for 23-24. Jane will come in with a high level of some of the detail contained within the budget before we move on to examination by your committee of the budget. So the budget proposed is balanced for the forthcoming financial year as required by the Local Government Act 2003. This is the first budget that's been presented by the new cabinet, and it's been developed in a time of significant uncertainty. 2022 has brought challenges with the war in mainland Europe as Russia invaded Ukraine. Inflation is at a 40-year high. The UK is entering recession, and the continued cost of living crisis has driven up prices for individuals, businesses and services. The continued impact of the UK decision to leave the European Union, the legacy of COVID-19 pandemic, along with a lengthy period of austerity, have all eroded the resilience of public services. If the next UK government sticks to the lean spending plans proposed by the current government, future spending settlements are projected to decline, and analysts are reporting that this would almost certainly imply a return to an era of spending cuts and above inflation council tax increases. So it's within this context that we've developed these plans, and the council is seeing significant financial pressures across all services from inflation and increased service demand. Even with the additional resource funding provided through the settlement, and it was a good settlement this year from Welsh Government, the high levels of inflation currently being experienced means the funding provided is now worth less in real terms. So that's just to set the scene that we're working in, Chair, and I'll pass over now to the 151 officer to give you some high level detail of the contents of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to cover the things that Councillor David has also already mentioned, but I think it's really important to consider the context in terms of the position that we set this budget in, both for next financial year, but also having that eye on the longer term as well. I think that's absolutely critical, and that's why we developed now for many years a 5-year medium-term financial strategy and an indicative capital programme over 5 years that gives us that foresight into the future and where we're heading. As Councillor David said, we've had a better than expected settlement at 8.7%, which on the face of it sounds really, really good in terms of that level of increase, but you have to put that again in the context of the environment that we're operating in, which is obviously that increase is lower than current levels of inflation, although we are expecting those to start to fall during next year. With all of that in mind, we've also had a settlement from a capital perspective that is not as good as what we're seeing from a revenue position. We are seeing a very slight increase in our capital allocation through Welsh Government, so not any significant increase there to support our capital programme. The report is quite extensive, as you appreciate. It goes through where we are for the current year. It looks at the funding settlement in detail, and it also goes through the process within which this budget has been developed. And I know you as a finance panel have had a view of how the budget's been developed in some of your previous sessions, and we've covered the business plan and the integrated business planning with you as well to give you a bit more insight as to how the budget has been developed. In terms of the overall net budget and allocations to services, table 5 within the budget report sets out exactly the proposed allocation for each service, but it also, in the table that you see there, sets out the level of pressure that our services are seeing coming through next year, but also the extensive level of savings that have been proposed at over 16 million to bring this budget back into a balanced position. So with the pressures that we're seeing that total around 25 million, the reductions in revenue budgets through savings of over 16 and a 5% increase in council tax, all of that collectively puts this proposal into a balanced position for 23-24. The medium-term financial strategy outlines the ongoing position for the council, and with funding settlements expected to be lower than what we're currently seeing, particularly in 2 to 3 years' time, where the government's current spending plans look to see quite a squeeze on public spending. We do have a significant budget gap over those 5 years. And I think everybody recognises that the council in its current form is not sustainable, and we all across the council have a challenge to put the council on a different footing, and that work has been started already in terms of reimagining the council and what it might look like with a lower level of resource. I'll touch very briefly on section 4 of the report that outlines my opinion as 151 officer in terms of the budget. I have that responsibility to advise council on the robustness of the budget being proposed, but also the adequacy of reserves that we hold to offset that continued risk in terms of our budget position. So section 4 does outline all of the things that I've considered in coming to that opinion, and then it does at the end of that section give my opinion in terms of this budget being appropriate and does respond to the need that I need to review. I'll leave it there, Chair. I'm sure there's a lot of detail in this budget, and I'm sure we'll unpick much of it now as we go through the next couple of hours.
Thank you. Thanks both. David, in the run up to the well, before Christmas, when there's earlier discussions on the budget, I can't quite remember what your words were, but it sort of described this year as taking the council up to the edge of the abyss, and then the following years we'd be going over. There was some analogy like that. I can't remember what you said, David. Could you repeat that?
Yes, I was basing it on the context of projected settlements going forward and the economic forecasts taking us up to 2026, where GDP at that, national debt at that time was being forecast by the OBS, I believe it was, or the Institute of Fiscal Studies to be running between 96 and 99% of GDP. So the reason I used that analogy was that if that were to be the case, that would seriously suggest that there wouldn't be a lot of money available for public financing.
Okay. So reading between the lines, do you think that that pressure has been eased with the settlement this time around and for the future years? I was
I
trying to
think
read between your lines.
this is what I was saying in some earlier commentary with regard to this budget, that I believe that the budget we're setting for next year actually sets us up on a good platform to protect services to take us forward when we develop a program around reimagining Powys, which will look at all services and the way we deliver them in the future.
Okay, thank you. And before I forget, Jane, can we touch on capital? Remind me to touch on capital afterwards, and I would want some explanation about how come our increased level of support from Welsh Government is so small compared to other local authorities. If you can explain that to us, just remind me when we come to discuss capital when we go forward. Thank you. Members, Wyn has helpfully set out on the agenda how we could approach this scrutinizing the budget. And it's a little bit of an overview as well in section A of his comments, and then he moves on to B, where he highlights the MTFS and the FRM, which the FRM is a particularly important document. I was wondering if anybody would like to pick up some of the questioning on that, and whether the specific funding of the services and what the impact on those services would be. I'd keep it at a fairly high level. I know there's been scrutiny of individual service areas on yesterday and the day before. There was education on Monday, along with economy and in the afternoon, and followed by adults and children's yesterday. And I thought yesterday's meeting was particularly good. Who would like to kick us off?
I'm happy to ask a question, Chair. Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. It feels a little bit like Groundhog Day to me. So for the officers and for the portfolio holder, it must be of a similar type of nature. And I'm just trying to get context, and it's some of the higher level stuff to understand of where we're going in the future as well. I think both Jane and David in previous presentations have indicated some of the challenges that the council is going to be facing over the next few years, and particularly in relation to external factors and inflation particularly. So when I see the budget that was set, and the settlement was obviously very positive, in the sense of the uplift that we received, but going forward that settlement is going to be much lower. And to me, we've set a council tax for council services at 3.8%. I'm just wondering, in relation to that, are we stacking things up where council tax is going to have to be increased significantly more in the future by us taking really what I felt was a relatively low level of council tax increase? Now, I understand there is the cost of living pressure, so I understood that. But to me, if we're going to be going from 8.6 uplift that we had, that's going to be dropping down to about 3%, so a 5% reduction down. That's going to put more pressure onto the council tax levels in the future of us trying to balance or pulling from further reserves, and our reserves are going down quite significantly in this. So I just wanted to see, are we now in that of setting the council tax level at that rate, or are we within the norm? And it's just to get those assurances around that. Thank you.
Chris, I'm sure Jane will want to add to this, but from my point of view, I think the initial challenge was to attempt to keep the council tax as low as possible, bearing in mind the cost of living crisis that we're working our way through. And I think we've done that to some degree, and we protected services as best we can. But it was necessary to set a council tax because that'll protect the base next year, the financial base next year, because we are anticipating a much lower settlement. So with that council tax base increasing for next year, that'll give us some protection with regard to us not having to set too heavy a council tax in 24-25. In all probability, if we had set a council tax at 0 or 1% perhaps this year, we'd certainly have had to have used more reserves or cut more services. But by setting it to that level, it does give us some protection going into next year, and hopefully, you know, because with the expected lower settlements, that'll give us some cushion against protecting our services going forward in the future. And bearing in mind that all the current forecasts are suggesting that a lot of the external economic pressures, such as inflation, will be reducing, which again will offer us a little bit of leeway with regard to the cost of our services. But I'm sure Jane would want to add something to that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Jane, please. Well, unless Anita wants to. Anita, perhaps maybe, are you picking up on this point? You have your hand up, and perhaps Jane can deal with both.
Yeah, it is a continuation on the subject of council tax. Firstly, good to see you all again. You may be aware that I've been effectively off for the last 5 months, doing what I can, but I am back and back in full strength. So I apologise if I've missed some conversations as well. So some of the questions I may have been answered in previous sessions, but bear with me while I play catch up. So the first one on the council tax was the fire authority. Obviously that's been a large proportion this year, and I wanted to understand if that's going to remain the same level going forward, or if they're looking at other solutions to plug their funding gap, or are they going to be relying on council tax for that? And then also on council tax, I'm aware that we get a relatively low settlement in comparison to other authorities, based on us having a higher level of you know, houses in the countryside, what detached houses, I think is the way it was explained to me. And I think there was a review being undertaken into that. So I just wanted to know if that's correct, and whether that will help future settlements. And the final one on council tax was, I know that with Welsh Government we have the opportunity to set a premium for second homes, and where our thinking is on that, and whether we've investigated that, because I know it can be split across the authority. It doesn't have to be a blanket rule from what I understand. So those are my 3 questions on council tax.
Thank you, Anita. Jane, could you firstly continue what David was addressing, and then Anita's got more specific questions on the council tax system. Thank you. You're mute, sorry.
I'd be used to that by now. In terms of setting council tax, it is very much a balance. You have to consider the ability of people to pay alongside the services you have to maintain for our residents, particularly those that are the most vulnerable and are more reliant on our services. So it is a balance. That balance is here for you as councillors really to consider in terms of setting your overall budget proposal. The impact assessment that accompanies this budget does go through that in a little bit more detail. It looks at average wages across the council and various aspects that have helped Cabinet come to the proposal that you see before them today. I think in terms of council tax levels, we're starting to see proposals now coming through across Wales. The council tax rate does vary quite considerably. I think it ranges at the moment from one council looking at setting a 1% council tax to another setting a council tax as high as 10%. But looking at the authorities that we're starting to see formally propose budgets now, I think the average is around 5%, which is where Powys is proposing that level for the council. In terms of second home premiums, I'll move on to some of the questions that Councillor Anita raised. Yes, second home premiums and empty property premiums have both been reviewed and both are set to increase from April. So that's something that has already been approved. There are some council tax reforms and things being spoken about and considered at a national level. We're not seeing any of those coming through at the moment. And I suppose in terms of what that might look like, we'll have to wait until those reviews are completed to fully understand the impact of that on Powys. Powys does have, as you said, a relatively higher council tax base compared to other authorities, and that does have an impact on how the settlement plays out in terms of those with higher council tax bases. When the overall settlement is increasing at the type of level that we're seeing now, actually we gain from that perspective, but when it's in a different scenario where we're losing funding and much lower levels of settlement, then yes, we do lose out because of our council tax base in those circumstances. So it's a bit of a balance there, but at the moment we're faring well because of the increase, but that won't continue, as we said, if we're seeing negative settlements. Just pick up on the fire levy as well. All authorities receive some funding in their settlement to be able to pay the levy to the fire authority. The fire authority and the chief fire officer sets the budget for their individual fire services, and that has to be sufficient for them to maintain a certain level of service across all of the authorities that they look after. And they too are facing significant pressure in terms of inflation, pay awards and so on, and that debate is still ongoing, as we all know, across the country nationally at the moment. So the fire officer sets the level that he feels is appropriate, and then local authorities, although we do challenge the fire officer in coming to that position, you know, we argue and challenge him that he needs to consider the efficiencies as we do in terms of setting that budget. And that has been going on for some time in part of those discussions. So we are now seeing an over a 17% increase in that fire levy. And that is something that we have to manage within our overall budget position. That won't go down from that level. It's very unlikely that it will go down, but we would hope if inflation comes down, the future years increases will be much more at a much lower level, similar to what we've seen in the past when they've been around the 2-3%. So yes, it is an extraordinary year in terms of the increases that we're all facing.
Thank you, Jane. Just to add to that, the fire levy, 1.2% of the council tax, what is that worth roughly? Just over £1 million, wasn't it?
Yes, it was 1.2 million, if I recall. I got the report.
So that will more or less stay in the base forever now.
I would expect so, yes, at the moment.
It's unlikely they'll have a reduction of their claim, but they normally ask for about £200,000 or £300,000 additional year in, year out.
Yes.
So there's always a big chunk, not a big chunk, but a significant chunk of the council tax paid by Powys County residents that goes, is passported straight on to the fire authority. There's a good little summary of the impact of council tax changes in the impact assessment that Jane's pulled together, explaining that Powys self-fund itself to slightly over 30%. So 70% is contribution from Welsh Government, 30% from the council taxpayers, and that can vary. We're third highest in Wales. It's only Vale Glamorgan and Monmouthshire that are higher, and then some others, it's an 80-20 split. So that's far more favourable for those county councils. So it's one of the bees in my bonnet, and it has been for years. But it clearly is not going to change very quickly. The other issue around council tax reform, there has been talk about council tax reform from Welsh Government for some time, and it's really complicated. The easiest solution and most likely solution is a revaluation, which will probably be bad news again for Powys. It'll probably increase that 70-30 splits, increasing it up from 30. So, but that's we'll wait and see what comes of that, really. Thanks, Anita, for those questions. Anybody else want to ask a question before I look at the how you've balanced the budget? No. Really important document is the FRM, and it shows there the cost reductions of almost £16.5 million. Can I ask David, which of that £16.5 million, what elements of one-off funding exist in that £16.5 million, whether they're grants or one-off elements which will immediately impact on the following year's budget?
I haven't got the exact figure in front of me at the moment, but I think it's £2.4 million.
2 point, and that's
Jane can give the exact figure. And it's £2.4 million, and I think there might be another £1 million in the HDR budget.
I know there's the BES grants of £500,000. Jane, can you go through?
If I pick up on the individual elements, there are a couple of one-offs that total £1.5 million that are around funding body reviews and direct payments, refunds that we expect. So those are one-offs and support the budget this year. There is also then the one-off proposal to reduce the level of revenue contribution going into fund replacement vehicles. That is another £1 million. So I think those are a couple of one-offs. There are some other elements within the budget supported by grant on a one-year basis. I haven't got the total of those here. I know that there are some small elements of that within adult social care. And I was trying to look for the HTR one, but I haven't found it as yet, and I can't remember if that remained. I know there were some where there was some doubt, and we did remove some that we weren't confident that would be there.
Yeah, it's still on. Oops, I can't find it myself now. It's on the pressures sheet on the final page, number 85. On the final page, number 85, on the pressure sheet, coming from cost pressures relating to inflation increasing above.
I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a reduction in the level of pressure, wasn't it, being supported by that grant, which is £540,000. Yes. And
the next line over in the 24-25, it shows it goes straight back in, doesn't it?
Yes.
Except on the sheets, it's still red. You've coloured it red, but it should be black, really, shouldn't it?
I think some of the rationale behind that lies in the fact that we are anticipating a significant decrease in inflationary pressures going forward. So when you consider that on average, a 1% increase in inflation has been costing us about £1 million, if forecasts are correct and we get a decrease of perhaps £6 million, that's some significant pressure taken off services, which might allow them to cover some of these costs that are one-off and carrying forward into the following year.
Yes, but that BES funding, there's a deficit there now, and that BES funding is been used to cover off that deficit within the HDR. So that deficit will still be there next year, won't it?
You're talking about the bus emergency scheme.
Yeah.
That's being used, yes, but that's kind of, my understanding of that is that it's a separate pot altogether. It's an emergency funding scheme, which will fund that adjustment within the transport elements of the HDR budget.
Yes, for 1 year only, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unless there are plans to reduce the spend on service buses in the following year.
Well, it's anticipated, this is the point I'm making, it's anticipated in the following year that service won't experience the pressures it's experiencing this year, inflationary pressures in the main, and they're not going to be there, hopefully, unless economic forecasters have got it completely wrong at the moment.
Yes, I wouldn't totally agree with you. I'm not sure if inflation will deal with that particular element.
It's not funding that's coming out of the base budget. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's a separate fund, the best funding.
Yes, but it's balancing this year's budget, isn't it?
It's supporting some of the costs for the operators, isn't it? See, as they've seen that increased level of cost, but it is there for 1 year. We have received that funding for a number of years now as well, which has helped to support the budget. So it's important that we do factor in all sources of funding into the budget plan that again limits that pressure on council tax.
Okay. I think it came into being with the pandemic and the crisis that bus operators were facing. I think it's the 3rd year possibly, or maybe 4th year of the funding. So it will create an immediate pressure at the beginning of the next financial year, won't it?
If costs don't come down, then yes, that pressure may well be there and something we'll have to manage in 24-25 as well.
Okay. So there's, I can't remember what the total was now. So there's quite a bit of one-off funding. You haven't really referred to the use of school reserves to help balance the budget. Isn't that also one-off funding?
Yes, in terms of school pressures, we've passported all of the money that we've received from Welsh Government within the settlement. So there was an increase in terms of the education standard spending assessment, and all of that money has been passported to schools to help them deal with the teachers' pay award and some of the pressures facing them. But we haven't been able to fully fund all schools to cover all of those pressures necessarily. So similarly to the rest of the organisation, schools will have to be forthcoming with some proposals to help manage that themselves. But we've recognised that some schools have significant reserves and they will be able to draw on those. But we are recognising that you can only draw on reserves for a limited period of time. Once they're gone, they're gone. So that pressure is then recognised again in the 24-25 year, if it still exists. And obviously, once we come to be setting that budget for that year, particularly, obviously that will need to be reviewed.
And yes, a confidential paper that came to education scrutiny on Monday did show a significant shift in school reserves from a positive £9 million position and over 2 years going into a negative position. Is that sustainable?
It's not sustainable over the longer term, but I would argue that some of those schools haven't necessarily considered recovery plans, and we very often see the early forecast from schools at those levels until governing bodies have looked at them, considered the action taken, and then proposed a more realistic budget in May. So they are early indicative figures, but they won't be final figures, and it's unlikely to make or to come to that position because schools will have to put those plans in place to recover.
Okay.
I think it's, can I just mention, as we were discussing that, if you look at schools at the projection at the end of, well, at 31st of March 2024, there's only one sector of schools that's actually showing the deficit, and that is secondary schools. And we are looking to address that situation in the future. But
Yes,
all the others are showing positive projections, despite the fact that they're handling this enormous challenge of inflation, etc. And it's a credit, really, that they're going to manage their way through that.
yes, there's probably, roughly speaking, there's two sectors, primary and secondary. So half this school delegated budget is showing real stress, and the other half of the delegated, the primary section, is showing significant falls. I've asked for further information of that.
Yeah.
I know you're unwilling to deal with it in public session, which is disappointing because it clearly puts a huge pressure on the budget. So
I think can I just make, I think the important point to make on this is that if you go back to the 31st of March 2022, schools were showing a significant a cumulative surplus, but there was £5.7 million of grant funding received very, very late in that figure. So if you take that out, despite the fact that the overall figure is negative at the end of March 2024, it's not significantly less than what it would have been without that 5.7. And that's despite the fact that we've had these huge inflationary pressures for the 2 years in between. So I think that's showing up to be quite positive. And the primary sector is showing a surplus overall. The all age sectors showing a surplus overall, and the special schools are showing a surplus overall at the end of March 24. But I do accept that there are challenges within the secondary sector, and we will address that.
Yeah, yes.
During the year, in all probability, it'll be on a case-by-case basis if schools are struggling.
Okay, and I did, and clearly there's a huge variation between schools as well, and sometimes cumulative totals do sort of hide serious issues within some schools. I know we agree on that, and thank you for the assurance as well, Jane, that the school's policy for financing schools remains in place. And I just want, schools will be setting a budget by, is it 31st of May? I can't quite.
I think it's something like the 5th of May. It's a
5th of May.
funny date, but it's very early May.
Okay. And then you as, well, not personally you maybe, but you will have to decide, the council will have to decide whether it's a licensed budget or not.
Yeah.
And will the same restrictions be applied to the schools that are in unlicensed positions?
The scheme for delegation of schools and the licensing of deficits, the exact same policy remains this year as it has in every other year, and we will work very closely with schools to help them manage any of their budgetary issues, and we will take action where needed should those governing bodies not take appropriate action. I think it is fair to recognise that some of the deficits that we're seeing, particularly across the secondary sector, aren't as a result of the inflationary pressures we're seeing now. They are deficits that have been incurred over a number of years. And I think a lot of our schools had, over the last couple of years, got back to a much firmer footing in terms of an in-year position, although they weren't able to necessarily reduce those deficits by any significant amounts over that period. But it's still a challenge that they have to try and repay those deficits that happened many years ago.
Yeah, and clearly huge proportion of the funding goes to staff costs. I'm not sure what the percentage is. It's probably around the 90%.
80 to 90%, yeah. 80 to
90%. I got a feeling it's probably nearer 90 than 80 from the last time I looked. But schools have been protected to a certain degree in this financial year from increased fuel costs through this council's buying scheme. So do we expect to see the fuel costs leap next, beginning of the next financial year, or whenever those contracts come to an end?
We have been, lucky is not the right word, is it? But we have been fortunate this year that our contracts protected us through the current financial year to a degree. But the renewal of those contracts are to be in place now from April. So although we've seen some of that pressure ease a little, we're still expecting to see quite a hike, and that will be included in the plans that you see before you in terms of those pressures.
Yes, so there's been significant use of reserves when some of those challenges haven't been fully realised yet. But that's just quick comment. You say that all funding from Welsh Government has been passported on to schools. Welsh Government only accounts for 70% of the funding. Powys County Council accounts for the rest. Have Powys passported on as an equivalent level of funding to schools?
In terms of the 30%?
Welsh Government sort of loosely ring-fenced some funding, saying that was supposed to go to schools, and David said all that additional money for targeted at schools was will be allocated to the schools. But my point is that only makes up 70% of the funding. 30% of the funding comes from local authority, and the percentage increase from the local authority is 5.5%. And that's when you look at table, whatever it is, table 5, I think, is probably the caption of table 5 has gone. I think it's table 5. It shows that the amount of money allocated to schools has one of the lowest increases in this year's budget at 5.5%, and there's education is 6.5, HGR 10.4, H and smaller budget, admittedly, 40% increase for one budget. There's only one line, adult social services commissioning, that's lower than schools out of those list of increases to various services across the council. Have schools been unfairly targeted?
I wouldn't say schools have been unfairly targeted. I think in terms of the process that we've gone through as we've developed the budget, some services were putting forward additional savings, and each one of those have been gone through through a series of challenge events with the senior leadership team of the council, and looked at the impact of what that might be in terms of having to remove some of those costs. And that's why you see different percentage allocations across each of those services, because that level of challenge has been gone through to establish what's appropriate or not. And I can see, yeah, where you're quoting those increases from. It's the net increase, isn't it, on each of the service budgets in table 5. Yeah. Yeah,
no, yeah, it was table 5. Yeah. Thank you.
Are you suggesting then, Alec, that the 30% you're referring to is the 30% of the budget of the revenue
funding? Yeah.
That we raise through council tax.
Yeah, 30% through council tax.
That 30% wouldn't equate as a percentage into an increase in a base budget on any service. No. So on that basis, if you look at the school's budget, yes, the increase there is a lot lower than some of the others. They've got much smaller budgets though on that basis. But in turn, if you look at the actual savings that are being asked of schools, they've got about the lowest ask. So I don't think it'd be fair to say that they've been treated unfairly, because in actual fact, for the level of savings against their base budgets, it's very, very low.
I probably got an issue with the delegated, those savings indicated as a delegated budget. It's a delegated budget. These can only be suggestions by the council. You should be saying you're going to tweak the formula, school funding formula, and that should be going through the right forums, the schools forum, to make those tweaks to reduce that level of funding on property costs or back office costs. Is this the right way to do tweak delegated budget funding of the delegated budget, or is this legal?
Can I just add to that? I think in terms of the table and how it's shown, it's making sure that we're providing a transparent view of where schools are. So in terms of the formula, what you will see is the increase in the level of funding. So the 4.395, that additional amount will flow through the formula as appropriate. What the table is showing is the level of pressure that schools are facing. And what that results in terms of a shortfall when you've given that funding to them. So although they're recorded there as savings, and you can see the adjustment column, those are suggestions and potential ways that governing bodies can limit their costs. So those savings are there as ideas for governing bodies, but you're right, governing bodies will have to decide how they manage that shortfall.
Okay, and it's okay, and you don't have to adjust the funding formulas to do this?
No, you would just put the additional funding in against the relevant headings within the existing formula. So you would add the money into the bottom level, or into that sausage machine as it's sometimes called, and that generates then the additional funding and each school's allocation.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was, you know, the indication is you're telling schools your property costs are too high, but it's sort of, I understand what you're doing, but I'm not sure if it's a correct way of doing it. Before I go down a complete rabbit hole, anybody else got questions on those service headings or schools or anything else? But I still want to come back to you and understand total one-off costs that are propping up or helping closing the gap, which will have an immediate pressure on the following year's budget. Gareth. Good afternoon, Gareth.
Afternoon, Chair. Thanks. We've been looking at some of the bigger savings in the budget, and to report to the panel something that was discussed and requested in the Audit and Scrutiny Committee was around, I think it's £2.5 million, is the savings into the pension contributions. And this is on the back of the latest revaluation. For comfort on this, ahead of the final report being published by the actuaries, the committee has asked for sight of the sensitivity analysis that's been adopted. And it goes back to this thorny issue of inflation. Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? One thing about the valuation is that it's highly sensitive to any changes in assumptions on inflation rates. That affects the funding ratio. So we're looking for early sight and that assurance from the actuaries, so that to get some comfort around those savings and any potential for fluctuations.
Thank you, Gareth. And I know John Brottingham is in a watching capacity here, but I'm happy enough for you to add to this, John. But I'll let Jane or David come back first.
Shall I come in? I think in terms of the reduction in the pension contributions, then the council has that complete assurance that that reduction has been considered by the actuary. It is very much being calculated based on prudence. It is down to how the pension fund has actually performed over the last 3 years and what that's now being projected to perform. You know, it's an ongoing position, isn't it? So very much a prudent approach has been taken by the actuary in those calculations. And we will have a statement for the Governance and Audit Committee that outlines that. And I think it's something that's been stressed by the actual advisory board, where any reduction in contributions is being considered, that they want assurance that that has been done in a prudent way, and absolutely that assurance is there. And I think what you'll probably see is that most authorities across Wales, where we've seen that good level of performance against our pension funds, most are seeing a reduction in the level of contribution. So we're not unique in that way. It is as a result of performance over the last few years, and those projections into the future being calculated on a prudent basis.
Thank you, Jane. Arwel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, just going on, Ray, from Councillor Gareth. Obviously, I'm sort of, shall I declare interest, but I'm the Vice Chair of the Pension Committee. But if I'm right, surely the recommendation from actuaries needs to be approved by the Pension Committee before they get sort of put into the budget. So is that true, Jane?
I don't think you need to necessarily approve it. I think the actuary actually states what those contribution levels should be, and they do the calculation. I know the Pension and Investment Committee has seen sight of the proposals as they currently are. In terms of the council's budget, then obviously we have to build that budget based on our current understanding, and it's on that basis that we would do it. But obviously the contribution rate when it's finalised at the 31st of March will be what's put in place at that time, and the council has no say in terms of that. That will be defined by the actuary.
Okay, so we can't, you know, we can't sort of object to it really. We've got to go with what the actuary says.
I think that's the case. I will double check that, but that's my understanding, yes.
Because obviously, you know, if that doesn't happen, well, obviously there's a big chunk, sort of, you know, not this year, but certainly there's 500,000 next year and 400,000 the following year. Yeah, which, you know, it does make a big difference really. But okay.
And I think if I can just come in there, I think for an assurance level, we've looked at that contribution rate building up over 3 years, which does give us the 3 years to have that level of assurance as to where it will get to. So I think that's been done on a prudent basis as well.
Yeah, because my thought is, okay, I've been in the Pension Committee for the last sort of 12 years, and okay, we've been underfunded greatly for the last sort of, you know, it's been improved. We've come up to a situation where we are nearly sort of 100% sort of funded, and lo and behold, you know, okay, I can see it helps the employee because it cuts their contribution, but are we going to be down the line in 3-4 years time as, okay, whether the Powers Fund has got to top up the pension fund, and whether we're going to have to increase the contributions again, really, you know, whereas if we maintain them at the existing level, well, I don't know. It's horses for courses, right? But okay, thank you, Jane, for the explanation. Anyway.
Diolch yn fawr, Arwel. I know all actuarial reports are really sensitive to inflation and other factors. Oh, I can see John popping up. He probably. I'll leave that to John. Go on, John. Tell us about the sensitivities of.
Thank you, Aled. I don't want to overstate this because, I mean, when we're talking about 2.5 million over 3 years, it is against a fund which is a total, I don't know what it is now, but it was at the last time I looked somewhere around 650 million. So I mean, it is a relatively small sum of money that we're talking about here in terms of savings for the budget when compared with the fund as a whole. However, I do have concerns around this. I actually had a look at the actuarial report for the previous one, which was dated March 2019. And I've had a look at the sensitivity analysis there, and it's quite stark. It says, for example, if inflation increases by 1% per annum over the assumption made in that report, the calculated funding ratio would fall from what it was then at 93% all the way down to 78%. The same thing would happen if the discount rate falls by 1%. So the point I'm making really is that we are in very uncertain times. And, you know, the experts may well predict a certain value for inflation. I don't know what the assumption is here. But it does seem to me that councillors ought to be made aware of, first of all, the assumptions that lie behind the budget, behind the actuarial figures before we put it into the budget, and also some idea of what the impact will be if those assumptions are wrong in either direction. That's just my point. It just seems to me otherwise it seems to me that members are voting on 2.5 million over the next 3 years quite blindly. I know they're following expert advice, and I accept that advice is sincere, but it may not be accurate.
Yeah, well said, John.
Yeah, just for clarity, the vote at the next full council will be just for the next 12 months. And it can be, those subsequent years can be adjusted. And I know we'll have another actuarial report in 2 years' time as well. Just over. But I go back and a couple of actuarial reports when I was the portfolio holder for finance, and they wanted £6 million additional in 1 year, £5 million the subsequent year, and that was 2 or 3 times the increased tax take council tax take we had in those years. It has a huge impact on council tax levels. I guess what's going on, John?
Can I just add one other thing? The contribution to the pension fund was, and I presume still is, in 2 parts. It's first of all a percentage of the salaries that are being paid to cover the current pension accrual. But also there is a second part, which is a payment against the deficit that existed at the time when the pension fund was changed from final salary to average salary. Now that was, a few years ago, we were paying, as you said, £5 or £6 million a year, quite literally, to bring down that deficit. If the 1.7 million, and I don't know what this is, if the 1.7 million that we're talking about for next year is largely made up of the past service deficits, I think I have a great cause for concern.
Do you know that breakdown, Jane? Or...
Yeah. We split the 2 different contribution rates are class primary and secondary rates. So the primary is the ongoing pension contribution, whereas the secondary rate is the deficit recovery. And it is the deficit recovery element of the fund that is improved significantly. So hence that is the contribution rate that you're seeing the most significant change to. But again, as I said, I think Governance and Audit Committee are going to look at this in a bit more detail. And we have got that statement, and that clearly sets out the assumptions that have been used in maintaining that prudent approach. And as I said, the Scheme Advisory Board will want to see that and have made sure that request has been in place. But also in terms of the recovery periods and all of those things, all of that has been taken on a very prudent basis to come to this conclusion. And in fact, where employers are in surplus, there is also a requirement, and I think the Pension Fund for Powys has actually included a buffer there as well, so that we don't reduce contribution rates down to the lowest level by having that buffer in place that does offer you a little bit more protection as well.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing that up, Gareth. I just wanted to go back to that question about balancing the budget in the FRM, about how much reserves, well, you can see from the FRM that it is use of reserves from schools of 3.8 million, and plus the one-off, what did we come to a total of the one-off grants and other sources of funding? and because there's a little bit of risk around some of the adult social services, because you need a third party to agree to some of those savings as well. What did we?
It's around just over 3 million, I think, in total.
And then plus the 3.8 from the schools on top of that, is it?
But that's not necessarily all coming from reserves, is it? There may be changes in schools to do that as well.
Okay, such as?
They would look to review expenditure across the school budget, not necessarily drawing all of that from reserves.
Okay. Okay. I assume a lot of that work is ongoing at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're working very closely with schools at the moment.
Okay. You don't, I guess but that figure is there to balance the budget at the moment. And you can't give us, it looks like school reserves and movements. What are the movements?
Well, each school looks at the funding available to them and looks at the budgets then that they set based on that funding availability. So schools do that on an annual basis, don't they? They review their staffing structures, they review other costs in the school to actually set a balanced budget. So it could come from a number of sources.
Okay. And if we go to, let's try and find the right page. On the impact assessment, the overall impact assessment, it's page 196. I think it's in that area somewhere, just below, before 200. There's so many papers in this bundle. It is quite a struggle to find. And there's a bit of narrative there around the schools, isn't there? David, oh no, well, it wasn't you that wrote it, but you signed the impact assessment of.
Setting the cost, are you referring to the sentence in the cost reductions around governing bodies?
Yes, I'm sorry, I just can't find it at the moment, but it did refer to reduction in redundancies, basically a reduction in the number of teachers. It did talk about redundancies there, didn't it?
Okay. Can't see which page. The only sentence I can see at the moment talks about governing bodies needing to identify cost reductions in their school budgets.
Okay, I'll probably find it before the end of the meeting.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get into the impact assessments. They're on another screen with me, and I've been signed out. So, which one are we looking at?
The overall council one, Appendix I, is it?
All right, I haven't got that here yet. Yeah.
I think so. Apologies, I can't find it now, but it did quite clearly reference the need for redundancies to help balance the budgets.
I think that could be referring to the facts that prior to the 5.7, 5.9 million, 5.7, I think it was, that came in late in 2021, there were a number of schools that did have budget deficit recovery plans in place, and some of those plans did involve potential redundancies to balance the budgets. But what happened in some schools, instead of actually keeping those budget deficit plans alive, they used that extra money that came in to put them back into a surplus position, and the deficit plans, recovery plans, were actually put to one side. So were they to be reintroduced now, certainly, if there were potential redundancies included in those plans, they'd be reintroduced. And indeed, the savings coming out of those recovery plans would alleviate some of the impact that's proposed within the use of these reserves.
Okay. I'll find it eventually. Apologies.
But
Does anybody?
right,
Arwell?
you're talking the overall, the impact assessment, the overall impact assessment
Yes,
with regard to council tax, etc. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've got that in front of me now. Do you know whereabouts?
It talks about education somewhere. Apologies. Can I go to Arwell just while I scan through
Yeah,
this document?
Yeah,
And,
okay.
Okay,
Arwell.
yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, it's just basically just a general comment really about sort of cutting school budgets and what have you. I'm a governing body on 2 primary schools. We've been firefighting for the last 5 years, and we basically we running out of options, and we can't do no more. And you know, there is a point where enough is enough, and I don't really know what the way forward is going to be, to be honest. It's just a general comment. Thank you.
Diolch, Arwell. There is quite a bit of variation between schools. Clearly, some schools face, and I did ask for that bit of work to be done, just to give us an idea of the range of challenges various schools face. Not that they want schools identified, but for the council to have a proper sight of the potential impact on some of the schools' budgets.
Yeah, I think this discussion also reinforces the fact that we really got to look at the transformation program for education within the authority going forward, and that perhaps needs to be speeded up. And then the amount of funding available within the envelope for education would be significantly increased for those schools that need it.
Yes. We can come to the capital budget in time, but clearly I don't see any evidence within this budget of speeding up the transformation process. Unless I missed it somewhere. David, perhaps you can point me in the right direction.
Well, there's the point I made initially. Well, the capital budget is being protected. There's no doubt about that, and that's built into it. But the whole purpose of this budget was actually, as I said earlier, to put us on a firm footing to take us forward after 12 months of incredibly difficult financial challenges. And I think we've achieved that. Obviously, that there's urgency and there's a lot of work going to be happening around a program that we've entitled Reimagining Powys. And when you are briefed on that, when that is ready, I'm sure you will appreciate the urgency that this cabinet is placing around transformation in all services, including education. But that's going to take time. It's a huge amount of work required in that. It's not going to happen overnight, obviously.
No, exactly, and that's partly my point. The funding issues will hit this council in 12 months' time, won't they? Well, you'll be starting to look at the budget as soon as you put this one to bed, to be honest. So next summer, you will almost need firm plans about where the budget is going. And it would give me far more confidence looking at this budget if we had a skeleton outline of your words and the leader's words about reimagining the council's budget. At this point in time, it feels as though we're treading water.
It's not reimagining the budget; it's reimagining the way that services are delivered.
Yeah, but we
because
don't see any evidence.
As I said in my opening statements, despite the improved level of funding within the settlement this year, it's still insufficient to fund all our services, and we simply can't continue like that.
No.
So that's why we've identified an urgency once we've got some stability built back into the budget to take us forward around transformation, etc.
Yeah, and despite that urgency and a relatively positive settlement this time, there's still a significant amount of one-off funding being used. You said
with respect, when we say positive, it was an improved settlement and it was a good settlement as opposed to what we were expecting. But it's not positive because bear in mind, it's still well below the rate of inflation. And the part of the reason for that is because the settlement the Welsh Government have received was well below the rate of inflation. Now, obviously, if you get a settlement that's below the rate of inflation, then you're going to struggle to deliver services. But I'm quite pleased to say that despite that fact, and despite the ongoing financial pressures we're facing, we've still managed to protect our services going forward. We've not had to take a service out. There's no service disappeared completely. The majority of savings that we made in services have been done through service redesign and income generation, as opposed to significant service cuts. There are some, well, that goes without saying, but the majority of the savings and efficiencies have been achieved through service redesign and income generation. But the urgency after 12 months of significant financial challenge was to get some stability back to take us forward. And I think we've achieved that.
You criticised central government, Welsh Government, for not delivering enough funding, but at the same time, the one element or 30% of the budget you have in your control, you only raise an additional 3% increase on the council tax. That's one area you have in your control. That's way below the rate of inflation, and it significantly undermines the buying power of the council. Isn't that?
Yes, yeah, it is well below the rate of inflation. Indeed, I think it's the first time in 5 or 6 years that I can remember there's actually been set that council tax increase has been set below the rate of inflation, which is positive in itself. But at the same time, as I said in our opening statements, and I think as the 151 officer stated as well, we've had to take into consideration the severe cost of living crisis that's facing our residents at the moment. So a huge increase in council tax would simply have been negative because people wouldn't have been able to afford to pay it anyway.
So
something was necessary because we had to protect the budget for next year going forward, or in all probability to protect services next year, we'd have been faced with an even higher rate of council tax increase.
So the use of reserves and one-off funding within this budget to balance a budget, what is that equivalent to in council tax?
It's council tax is meant to cover that. As I explained earlier, the anticipation is and the expectation, all right, it's based on projections and predictions, but unfortunately, like it or not, the majority of financial planning is based on predictions. If you look at our treasury management program, a lot of that is based on expert predictions. And what the expectation is that a lot of the financial pressures that are developing through inflation, etc., are going to ease off quite significantly over the coming years. Unless central governments have got it completely wrong. You know, and the Bank of England and the Treasury have got all their forecasts completely wrong. Well, then we have got a problem.
Are you saying the inflation is going to take, falling inflation is going to take care of the deficit that you will see at the end of this?
Well, yeah, well, roughly inflation has been costing us, every 1% increase in inflation is roughly costing us £1 million. So potentially, if you get a reduction of 5%, I think the forecasts are suggesting it could be a reduction of 6% within 12 months. So you're talking about another £6 million, and that'll be more than cover the one-off savings.
Yes, we're talking about a fall in the rate of inflation. We're not talking about deflation. The costs in the system will remain there going forward.
Exactly,
and you have not covered that by recurring funding stream. It's been covered by that gap is being covered by one-off payments.
No, it's covered by the increase in the base budget already for next year. And the point you're missing is inflation is currently running at over 11. Well, it's just under 11% now, but back in October it was running at over 11% when we were having these initial discussions. The forecast then was that it was going to come down by the middle of next year to about 4.6%. So potentially you're looking at least a £6 million saving then, simply on inflationary pressures alone. Now, the council tax that increased this year that's been built into the base budget for next year, that's a completely separate thing. In actual fact, you're looking at a surplus from between the one-off payments and the reduction in the inflationary rate. So you add that to the council tax that's been built into the base for next year, and then that more than puts us on a sound footing to go forward.
clearly don't agree on this. The pay inflation for this year you put in at
I'm talking about general inflation, non-pay inflation.
yes, the pay
Because
inflation.
that's the service pressures. Service pressures and non-pay inflation. The pay inflation is a separate thing altogether.
There's service pressures which incorporate pay inflation as well. There's no doubt
Well,
about
no,
that.
you'll see them in table 5. They're listed separately. The pay pressures are listed separately to the non-pay inflationary pressures. That's quite clear in table 5.
Yes, no, I was talking about our contractors. There's pay inflation there, isn't there?
Well, that's part of the capital program. That'll increase the cost of the contract. So that's where that pay inflation comes in. That's a
I
separate
was
thing
thinking of
altogether.
social services. The pressures in social services, more or less.
Well, if they're our own service people, then that's the pay inflation element you've got there. The actual running of our own elements of the service, if they're our own homes, that's an inflationary pressure, not a service inflationary pressure, not a pay inflationary pressure. If it's a contracted service, if it's a care home that isn't a Powys care home, then that's part of the capital program. It's what we pay them.
It's not. Sorry,
we
Jane,
don't pay their wages.
It's
and
clearly not
actually,
right. It's clearly wrong here. It's nothing to do with the capital.
In terms of pay that relates to contracts, obviously if they're capital schemes and we're paying contractors their salary costs through the building thing, that is capital.
Yes.
Whereas when we're paying for a revenue service delivery through a contract, that would be considered as non-pay inflation because it's contract inflation. So that would be recorded here under the service pressures rather than in the pay element.
Thank you, Jane.
That's what I was saying.
Okay. The pay inflation in this current year is £6 million. What percentage have you been? Are you allowing for?
There's two elements to it. We built into, so for schools, obviously the teachers' pay award from September was built in at 5%. So the pay that's included in those pay columns for schools would be based on that. And then they have a part year, and then there's an indicative pay award for teachers next year of 3.5%. So that's been built into the school's delegated budget figures. For other pay inflation, again, we've built 3%, I think it is currently, into the service budgets, but we've held another 2% centrally until we know for sure exactly what those percentages are likely to look like.
Okay, have you held any centrally for potential over 3% for teachers as well?
Yes.
You have, okay. So that's covered off.
Well, it depends on what the pay awards finally agreed at.
But yeah, and those have been set aside. They're not recurring, are they?
The pay awards?
No, the reserves.
They're not set aside as reserves. Those are set aside as base budget, although held corporately.
Okay, the base budgets. Fine.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, I don't think we're going to get anywhere here, but the SIP. Oh, sorry, Aaron, you're out to what is your current question?
Well, no, thank you, Chair. No, obviously, you've covered some of the aspects I wanted to cover, but I do sort of take umbrage. Councillor David Thomas I've heard it now on 4 or 5 occasions to say it's the first time that the Cabinet have set a council tax increase below the rate of inflation. Well, with no disrespect, if they can't do it this year, they will never do it. Whereas last year, the opposition, they wanted a 0% increase in council tax, and okay, we got 3.39, what have you, through. But where would we be this year if that hadn't have gone through? So I rest my case, Chair. Thank you.
I think the challenge actually is reversed, isn't it? When you've got high rates of inflation, it's far harder to set a council tax that's lower than that rate. because obviously that high inflation rate is impacting all services within the authority. So it's quite an achievement to be able to set it below and protect the services at the same time. The one thing I would say to what happened last year, I don't want to go into length about this because that's what we're not here about last year's budget. We're here about next year's budget. But nobody was to know back in January, February last year, what was facing us in the 12 months we've actually come through. The financial challenges have been absolutely enormous. And it's not just this authority. Every authority has had to pull out all the stops to try and manage that and reduce the impact on their residents. And I'm quite pleased with the fact that we managed to do that, and at the same time keep a level of council tax well below the inflation and at a manageable level. And I take, you know, I'd repeat it. I've got no problem in saying it, that, you know, it's the first time in many years that we've set that the inflation, the council tax rate has been set below the rate of inflation, and that's an achievement in itself.
We agree to disagree. Thank you, Chair.
But the impact of that is that it undermines the buying power of the council and probably the long-term sustainability of the council, because we see in the impact assessments references to, in the medium term, future of leisure centres may be under threat, and other such language. We have seen, and you know, a really difficult budget is when you have to set the council tax at 9.5%. Isn't that a really difficult budget?
No, the difficult budget is setting a council tax at a rate that's acceptable and doesn't impact residents too heavily, and yet at the same time managing to redesign services so you deliver the same service at less cost. That's what an effective budget is. That's good financial management.
Okay, the same services will be delivered at less cost.
Well, the budget, as I said earlier, currently, if you look at the proposals in the current budget, any changes, the majority of changes to service are delivered through service redesign, income generation, and some service reduction.
Or some service reduction.
And that's the challenge.
So it won't be...
Is to carry on delivering services at an acceptable standards and at a reduced cost. You know, if you want to carry on with the current funding envelope, the way we've been trying to do, what you'll end up with in 5 years' time are services that'll be second rate. And that's what we want to try and avoid. And the way we're going to change that is through consultation and talking to our residents and understanding what they want and what we need to do to deliver that.
As I said before, I don't see much evidence of movements. When you look at this year's budget, it's a standstill budget, which does put other services at risk.
I wouldn't deny that. I wouldn't deny it's a standstill budget, Chair, because that's the very point I'm making. That we had to go for stability in the first instance to allow us a springboard to move forward. Once we've got through this extremely difficult financial 12 months,
okay,
with all the challenges we've had to face.
Okay, so the school reserves and movements, clearly there's redundancies involved in that. No.
Let's not put words in into people's mouths now to go away from this saying that this budget is deliberately creating redundancies, because it isn't. Well, what I said earlier was that in all probability, prior to the extra money going into school delegated budgets at the end of 2021, there were school deficit reduction plans in place that in all probability might involve a level of redundancies. Now, because that £5.7 million has been used up,
Arwel, wyt ti ddim ar mute? Oh, diolch yn fawr. Sorry, David, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, part of that money was used in some schools, not all schools, but in some schools, to clear the deficit balance within those schools and put them back in a surplus position. Those deficit recovery plans then were then put to one side. Now we might be reaching a stage where we should be reaching a stage where they need to reintroduce those budget deficit recovery plans. And those plans that were in existence prior to this cabinet's coming into existence and prior to this budget being set might have included potential redundancies. That's not to say, I don't know what the situation was in every school. All I'm saying is that if those plans did include potential redundancies, then possibly, that might be the case again. But one thing is clear, that some schools were holding significant deficits, and they are going to be holding significant deficits again because that action wasn't taken to bring them back into surplus.
Yes, and so for schools to, as I said,
so the message is that this budget is not creating redundancies in schools.
This budget is underfunding schools by the tune of £3.8 million, and to put that right will require redundancies, won't it?
No, it'll require good financial management. It amazes me, that this discussion has to be based on the fact that simply because money is taken out of a budget, that's got to create redundancies. Because that's not what makes a good manager. The good manager manages his budget and readjusts and redesigns his budget to ensure that the human resource he's got in place can be maintained if required.
So this, the number of FTEs within schools will not fall.
I don't know, that the final decisions will have to be taken by the schools themselves. What the schools have got to
Well, you
ensure.
just said they won't fall.
What I said was that this budget in itself is not seeking to create redundancies in schools. How the schools manage the money they've been allocated is entirely up to them. And they'll have the support of education officers through their finance surgeries.
Exactly. But the school service delegated has been under. I don't know what happened in yesterday's cabinet about that 600,000, but perhaps you can tell us afterwards, David. The 3.8 million underfunding of schools will not see consequences of that. Will not be a fall in the number of teachers in front of the children within Powys schools.
It doesn't have to, no. Schools can look at efficiencies. If those efficiencies that are required do mean that they require less staff, well, that's a decision for the school to take.
Okay, Jane.
I just want to pick up on schools and how they manage staffing levels. Schools make staff redundant. Probably every financial year you will see some staff redundancies, but that's not just dictated by the funding that they have. It is dictated around pupil numbers and how many pupils they need to cater for, the number of classes that they need, and so on. So schools do manage staffing changes on an annual basis, and that could be increases or decreases in staffing. So there will inevitably be staffing reductions across schools as their numbers dictate. So I just wanted to point that out, really.
Yeah. And this £3.8 million underfunding will not exacerbate that.
They will have to look at the means of managing that, the same as any other service will have to do that, and that's whether there's alternative funding sources available to do that, whether they can draw on reserves to support that for a little while, or whether they can make changes in terms of their expenditure to accommodate it.
Okay. One of the MTFS principles is reserves will not be used to fund recurrent budget pressures or keep down council tax rises. Do you think that principle has been broken or not? David?
Sorry, Chair, I didn't catch that.
The MTFS principles, which are based on SIPFA stuff, talks about the number 5, reserves will not be used to fund recurrent budget pressures or keep down council tax rises.
We haven't used any of the general fund reserve to keep down the council tax or to fund budget pressures. The general fund hasn't been touched.
No, maybe not, but I was looking, it doesn't say.
I think the SIP,
it is
I think
reserves.
the policy of the council is that we keep, I think, 4.2% of the net revenue budget as a reserve. 4%,
is the minimum.
4%,
4%
and it's
minimum.
currently sitting at 4.2%.
Currently,
I-
I've asked for figures of where you expect that to be, not the general fund, the overall level of reserves at the end of the next financial year. That information is not forthcoming. Maybe, David, you could help me get those figures.
Right,
But in the meantime,
31st of March 23, is that what you're asking? The reserve general fund's going to sit
at the end of this budget, 2024, as a consequences of these movements.
Jane's got a hand up.
Yeah, can I come in on the reserves element?
Yeah.
The principle in the MTFS is, as you say, it is that we do not plan a budget that looks to draw on reserves to fund recurrent budget pressures. That is not what is being done within this budget. There is no baseline budget expectation to continually use reserves to meet ongoing pressures. Admittedly, there are some pressures that will be funded on a one-off basis, which is something that you look to do with reserves. So yes, we will be drawing on specific reserves set aside last year and in previous years to manage some of those costs, but that is only on a one-off position. And similarly with school reserves, if they're having to draw on those reserves as a one-off to manage pressures this year, then that's what they will look to do. But we do not have a recurring budget line in this budget to draw on reserves.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so there will not be a deficit or consequences of this schools use of reserves rolling over into the subsequent years. Because ultimately, if the school is in deficit, the bottom line is the council is responsible for that. And you know, high schools are potentially moving into a £4 million deficit.
If they don't take appropriate action, and that's what I've been trying to spell out really, is that schools will have to look at recovery plans that look to manage any deficits they're projecting at this time. And we won't have a clear understanding of exactly what that looks like until governing bodies submit their budget plans for next year.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I've probably flogging a dead horse here. But I really do find it unacceptable that schools are expected to deal with this. They've only, you know, they've got to produce their budgets by early May, and there will be significant challenges. And if all that's issue is to be swept up in 12 months, there will be significant consequences to staffing levels, and hopefully not too much consequences on the teaching of children. Jane.
I just want to come in again, and sorry, I should have probably said this before, but in terms of the budget plan, and in terms of being able to fund all of the pressures across the whole of the council, clearly that would have meant an increase of another 24 million into our budget plan. We clearly can't afford to do that as a council. We can't ask our council taxpayers to pay that level of increase to support that. So every service across the authority has had to play its part in coming to the table and looking at how best we can manage this collectively, and schools aren't immune from that. And I think the early conversations that we had with schools back probably September time, when we started to raise the issues that we're facing in terms of the level of pressure, we were quite open and honest with schools at that point in time that we wouldn't be able to necessarily protect them in their entirety against these pressures, and they would have to play their part in helping the council manage it. So I think that is the basis on which the budget's being developed, and that is the position that we find ourselves in.
And clearly this level of use of reserves is certainly not sustainable for the following year, let alone future years.
Absolutely, reserves are one-off. They are by
Yeah.
their nature. They're used to respond to challenges when you foresee them and have them in front of you, and that's what we are doing. But no, absolutely, you can't sustain that on a continual basis, and that's why we don't build a budget that relies on reserves on a continual basis, and that's not what we're doing here.
Okay, but the pressure could have been eased on the schools by better settlement for the schools through increasing the council tax.
Indeed, any increase in any service budget, you know, council has those options.
Okay, so the school reserves have been used instead of increasing the council tax to some degree.
Not for recurrent pressures.
No, it says or keep down council tax rise.
Well, council tax is based at 5%, but that's a matter for council to decide on as to what level it considers to be appropriate in the circumstances.
You know, I think at the end of the day, Alex, and to prolong this debate around schools and council tax, but if your panel want to make a recommendation to the cabinet that you want to see council tax increased to cover any costs in this budget, then cabinet would at least give that some consideration, but we'd have to weigh that council tax increase up against the current cost of living crisis. But if that's the recommendation you want to put, then I'm sure cabinet would consider it.
I won't be putting, I don't know if it's up to the committee to decide whether that is a line they would wish to choose. But what I'm trying to establish is significant risks for our schools in the rapid use of the reserves of this financial year and the next financial year. Would you agree there's a significant risk to the future stability of some of our schools?
Look, there's risk in any financial budget. That's the reality of financial management.
No, I was talking about significant risk.
There's always a level of risk, and that's got to be managed. Particularly, you know, during a period of significant financial challenge, that risk increases, and we've got to manage that risk.
So
and I feel I feel that this budget does manage that risk and protect services at the same time.
You don't agree there's a significant risk to our schools' budgets here? Some schools.
What I'm saying is that any budget during a period of financial restraint and difficulty is going to have an element of risk, and that's around all services, and all services have to manage that. That's the reality of things, you know. That's the way financial planning develops. Unfortunately, we'd all love to live in a world, you know, where we're always showing surpluses. They wouldn't need us.
I don't think Jane has ever had a budget where it doesn't contain risk.
We wouldn't need a Jane then, you know, if you're having surpluses all the time.
I've never known that happen, David. So
no.
There's always been risk.
And we'll always need a Jane. Yeah.
How you manage them and an acceptance rate that there's in my view, there's a huge risk for some schools going forward with the £3.8 million underfunding of the service, and that's clearly stated in the FRM. With those one-off measures to balance the budget, where is that pressure shown in the subsequent years FRM in that column?
Perhaps it might be best for me to come in, it's a bit technical, isn't it, in that question, in terms of the one-offs, where those one-off savings or adjustments or whatever you want to call them are included in the FRM, then you would see the corresponding pressure against the service in the FRM in future years. So that is what is building up to the budget gap that you see in those future years. So I think it's just over 10 million in year 2. That would incorporate all of those one-off solutions falling back into the budget plan for that year. So effectively what we're doing is buying a little time to help to address those on a permanent basis.
Okay, so all that one-off elements we've been talking about have been sort of transferred into one of those headings in the next.
Yeah, they would sit alongside the service heading. You know, although you're only seeing a snapshot of that FRM in the medium-term financial strategy, similarly, we have that at a service level. So where you see the 10.322 gap in 24-25, that can be shown in terms of the budget allocations across each of the service areas. You would see where that pressure is falling on services.
So that it's incorporated into that £15 million total service pressure line, is it? 15.478 million total service pressure.
I'm looking, but well, we've got so many tables now. I'm not sure which table you're looking at and which table I'm in the FRM.
Yeah,
Figure 7.
Appendix B.
It's the £22.3 million gap in 24-25. I'm looking
20. Oh yeah,
figure
that's a gap, that is, isn't
3.1.
it?
Yes, so that's showing the level of pressure against all of the services, and then we're saying even with funding of council tax and a projected settlement, it would still leave a £10.3 million gap.
Yeah.
Yet to be resolved.
And your impact assessment is wrong there. There's a mistake in that impact assessment. I think it's towards the end of the impact assessment, if I remember. There's a table. Oh, I got windows popping up everywhere. Sorry. I should have printed this out to be fair. There's a table with figures in it. If only I could find it. Oh, there it is. Page 189. Bottom line of that table 2, is it? Those are incorrect, aren't they?
Profile of savings delivery.
Yeah.
Cost reductions total required.
Talking £500,000 there, but that is savings identified to date, isn't it?
Yes.
Not cost
yes.
reductions total required. So
It's
those are
just
wrong.
what's identified. Yes, you're right.
Okay. Thank you. Right, members, we haven't really touched hardly anything on the budget, to be honest. What areas would you wish to move on to? No questions. Well, no, Anita, sorry, Anita. It doesn't show your full name on the window when you pop up. Apologies,
no problem.
Anita.
I just wanted to go back to Jane on the fire service. I've been looking back through the documents in the pressures, which is Appendix F, is it? Again, I'm jumping between everything. So Appendix, yeah, F, pressures. I'm just trying to understand what I'm looking at here, because it says fire levy for 22-23, 13%, and then 5%, whereas that contradicts what I think you answered to me previously, is that we'd expect the payment to the fire service to remain the same or increase in future years. So I just wanted a bit of clarity on that.
Yeah, what that shows is that for the fire service levy, we had indications of around 13%, then we were told it was going to go up higher. So there's several lines in that pressure that relate to the fire service total increase. But what we have done then for future years, we've assumed a lower level of increase at 5%. So the 13% or 17% as it is in total, when you add all of those things together, that goes into the base budget. And then those projections show that that could even rise further by estimated 5% year on year.
Okay. So yeah, it will continue to increase. It will just increase at a lower rate.
A
That's
lower
what we're
rate.
saying.
But that's based on an estimate at the moment. We don't know what those future rates will be, but we've estimated 5% at the moment.
Okay.
Right. Members, I just want one more line within the savings. It's the HTR, the delay of the investment in new vehicle investment fund for new vehicles. Sorry, what's the right terminology, Jane?
Yeah,
it's on the third page, and it's no, it's not. Apologies.
yeah, it's where we're looking to reduce the level of revenue contribution to the reserve that supports the replacement of vehicles.
Yes. Yeah. What level does that reserve stand at the moment?
Bear with me.
I was listening to I tried to attend the other scrutiny panels, and I was listening to the head of service for HTR suggesting that we may keep vehicles for longer. Has that job of work been done to understand fully the implications of that?
I'm not sure at a service level whether they've done that yet. I'm just looking, it's in the table somewhere, the transport reserve. I'm just
Yeah,
looking
I can't
quickly
see it.
to see it. Bear with me. Transport reserve. So at the beginning of this financial year, that reserve stood at 8.8 million. And I think that reflects that there's been delays over the last few years as well in terms of replacing vehicles. They are proposing to draw on that by around 2 million this year, which would leave a balance at the end of March of 6.7 million. So this budget proposes that that level of contribution is reduced for 1 year, where £1 million won't be put into that fund. So that would obviously what remains in that reserve will still be there. It's just that it won't be increased to the level it would normally be increased on an annual basis. But that is only proposed for 1 year.
Okay. Yeah, and as far as you know, the work on the impact of that on the fleet replacement hasn't been done to date.
I don't think that level, they will be looking at it. They will be looking at what they need to replace over the next few years, and they have a plan. I just haven't seen the detail or haven't got that to hand to be able to say it. But yes, the fleet service will be looking at that.
Apologies, I think it might be a problem on my end rather than your end. I missed half of what you said then, Jane.
I said, I can't remember what I said now. The fleet service will have a plan in terms of replacement of vehicles, so they will have the detail there around that.
I do remember one of the current directors being very clear a few years ago about carefully worked out plans, costings, about vehicle replacement. There's an optimum time to replace those vehicles. But then again, the head of service on Monday said perhaps we're selling them too soon. But then again, my experience over the last 12 months, bit more than 12 months, the whole recycling fleet has been replaced. And before that was done, we were having constant routes being cancelled because of breakdown, etc., etc. There's a sweet spot to hit. And I'm just wondering whether the work should have been done first before potentially taking this sum of money out, and it'll only lead to additional money having to be put in future years, and the cost, subsequent cost to the council. So I guess from what you're saying, that work hasn't been done.
I think though as well, because of the delay over the last couple of years and the availability of vehicles, that fund hasn't been drawn upon as heavily as it would have.
Okay.
So I think you've got some carry forward there that would see them through as well. This was something that was challenged when the proposal came forward, because initially the proposal was to make that reduction a lot higher than it is. But obviously that has been pared back now to the £1 million that you see within the budget plan. So some consideration has gone into that, as you can see.
Okay, thank you. Arwan?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just going on from exactly what you just discussed, Ray. I was on the meeting on Monday and I asked the same question and they said, oh, that they've sold their recycling vehicles to other authorities and they've had it for 2 or 3 years. So they seem to think that we've been selling ours sort of far too soon. But the issues certainly around this last sort of 4 or 5 months, all I've had is regarding recycling issues, and they come back and say that, yeah, vehicle breakdown and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's, you know, I totally agree with your comments really, and I think, you know, that the work should have been done before they decided to take £1 million from the budget. Thank you.
And just general point, I can see Matthew still here. The administration is very got a very strong green agenda, and I'm not. I think the head of the service said the replacement of existing vehicles with electric vehicles or battery operated vehicles would cost twice as much as they currently do. So where does this reduction in funding for replacement vehicles, how does that stack up against your wider objectives for making Powys a greener, more sustainable place?
Is that a question to me, Chair?
Well, since James isn't here, I thought I'd pick on you, Matthew. Sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. As you know, the ambition is clearly to get to net zero by 2030 as a council, but that's, you know, got to be taken into consideration against a number of external influences, including the financial resource and envelope that we've got available to us and the rate at which we can develop the infrastructure necessary to do that. But we're quite clear that is the council's commitment. We want to get there, and we'll do all that we can to get there within the resource that we've got. Now, it may be that we start the journey as slower than we would anticipate, and we start, you know, with a smaller number of vehicles. But we've seen that this can be quite successful. We've had, you know, electric refuse lorries operating as part of a pilot for some time now. So we'll be learning for that and look into the opportunities that we can to develop further rollout across the whole county. But as I said, you know, that can't be done without taking into consideration the external influences on the local authority.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, that rubbish. I can't remember what they call them. From RCT or something. Is it all bin lorry? I call it. It's bin
trying
lorry.
to use the acronym because I couldn't remember it either.
It's a bin lorry anyway. But it was supported by Welsh Government funding, wasn't it? I can't remember the figures. The standard one usually costs 200,000, and the one electric one is 400,000, or was it 400,000 costing 800,000? Can't remember which way around. But they basically double the costs, aren't they?
Well, you're right. They are more expensive to buy the actual kit, the unit, if you like. But what it doesn't take into consideration is the cost and the environmental costs of not moving to those. So yes, there is a greater capital outlay for the actual vehicle, but what that doesn't capture or measure is what the reduction in the impact of the environmental cost is from moving to a green vehicle. I think we need to move to a position where we start to measure those impacts as well, because, you know, if we're to do this effectively and fully understand the climate and environmental impact of the decisions we're making, we need to find a way to measure them.
I agree, and like a lot of this stuff, it's the upfront costs that really stifle it, and possibly taking £1 million out of that envelope is a backward step. But I guess you see it as something you had to do, really.
And all I would say, you know, in conclusion on that, is that the Stronger, Fairer, Greener corporate plan runs till 2027. So, you know, it's not a one-year plan; it's a long-term vision.
yeah, maybe it should be extended to 2030, so you see the full path to zero carbon. But
Happy to
well,
stay in office until 2030, Aled.
it run from one council to the next, don't they, these plans? Right. While you're there, they have, you know, we do talk about. I don't know whether you can point to other examples of investments in that process to reach. Is it net zero? Is it, or zero carbon? Net zero.
Your ambition is to be a net zero council by 20.
Net zero. Okay. Can you also highlight within this budget other areas which you think make a step change in that path towards net zero?
Yeah, there are a number of them. You know, reducing costs in our corporate buildings, turning the heat down, using less energy. That clearly puts us on that foot. Increasing our recycling as a local authority. We've always been a good performer, but we've clearly got more to do with that. Taking the fabric first approach that was started under the previous council to our housing stock and ensuring that our homes are as energy efficient as they can be. Putting grants into schools to increase their energy efficiency and move into renewables. Looking at the way that we can ensure that our housing stock uses green energy, and we've got examples of schemes where that's been done, particularly around Clyro and in Maes Maindy, where there's solar on those properties there. So there's a whole range of measures that we're able to put in as a council, some of it through capital, some of it through grant, but we need to do more. That work was started under the previous council, but we're clear that it needs to continue under this one and probably into the next one as well.
But in the capital program, I don't see much investment in schools, or certainly not badged as investment in school to try and reduce energy costs and consumption, to try and help balance their books. I don't see much evidence of that in the capital program, unless you can point to areas where that's happening.
So I don't have the capital programme in front of me, Aled, on the screen that I'm using. I'll hand to Jane or David Thomas for
that. Thank you. Do you want to pick up that hospital pass, David?
I can't give you specifics around the capital program, other than say the 21st Century Schools program is going to be, the modernisation around that is going to be ongoing. And I think we're looking to invest an additional £123 million on that in the next 5 years. So that will obviously include elements, well, it has to include elements of energy efficiency and a greener program. But with regard to specific capital schemes, I don't have that information in front of me at the moment.
Are there new elements within that capital program that weren't there before? Because by their very nature, they are sort of long term. Are there new elements contained within that capital program that weren't there before?
With regard to what? Obviously, the housing program within the HRA account, there's a lot of new house building going to be taking place. And they'll have to meet green standards.
Yeah, so how many new houses has, or can you put a figure on that, of additional houses that this budget is looking to build?
We are finalising the corporate plan at the moment, Chair, and that corporate plan will include measures around how many new social units will be brought in. That won't just be through building new, it'll be through acquiring and bringing empties back into use. So the figure hasn't been finalised yet, but it is an ambitious plan, and clearly that will, be a housing stock that's built to modern standards, that's energy efficient and using green measures where we can. just on the final reference point of schools, we've had a very clear steer from Welsh Government, as you know, that all new school builds must be carbon neutral, and we'll have to, within the school transformation project, absorb that ministerial steer and strategy from Welsh Government.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew. Yes, the new build repurchase budget is £13 million in the capital programme under the HRA. I'm not sure, and it goes up to 21, 27, back down to 14, 12, 94 over the whole 5 years. I'm not really sure to what extent new sums of money have been identified for that programme, but I guess that's maybe when the corporate plan is fully developed, we can see that there.
Yeah, I think that level of transparency is important. My understanding is, so the social housing grant figures that we get from Welsh Government, we get indicative figures for year 2 and 3 on a roll, if you like. So we work to those to be able to work with our partners in the Strategic Housing Partnership, where we've got 8 registered social landlords collaborating with us as a local authority in Powys. What that enables us to do is to work with them to see their pipeline projects come forward as well. So that over the course of that 2 to 3 indicative funding figures, we're able to give them some assurance and certainty about the projects that we'll be able to put in, clearly subject to, you know, planning constraints and things around phosphates. But the council has previously, under one of my predecessors, set some strategic priorities around those as well. And extra care was one of the top priorities, followed by general needs housing. So, you know, in the context of what those strategic priorities were and the social housing grant allocation indicative figures that we have coming forward from Welsh Government, we're able to build that into the capital plan with the HRA, but happy to continue to provide some assurance and clarity and transparency about the figures with this committee as required.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Matthew. What's the publication date roughly? Timeline for the corporate plan?
I've seen another draft copy this afternoon. I think it's going to be coming to council very soon. I think possibly the March meeting where we have the confirmation vote around council tax, but I'd need to check with the cabinet business manager to confirm it, and I can follow that up in writing after the meeting.
Perhaps it's putting the horse before the cart then, because that should be driving the budget more than the other way around. Well, but I know it's difficult timing.
We have absolutely tried to align resources to the aspirations of the plan, but things are being rewritten with the change in circumstances and rising costs and things in other areas to ensure that this is up to date and as flexible as it can be.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Committee, any comments? Sorry, apologies, it drifted into the capital programme. I hadn't meant to, but any comments on the capital programme as we see it in Appendix A, page 176 it is. Probably it's Appendix A of something else rather than the main report, but it's page 176 of your report back. I don't know, maybe I can draw John Brottingham into this conversation a little bit about the affordability of the capital programme going forward. Many in the past would say we can't afford not to invest, especially in the 21st, sorry, I shouldn't call it 21st century school programme, it's something else now, isn't it? But over the next 5 years, but getting on for £150 million worth of investment. Admittedly, a huge chunk of that will be supported by Welsh Government as well. But perhaps David can give us assurance about the affordability and what impact the changes, if there have been a bit of changes in the interest rate, what impact that has going forward. Oh, sorry, go on, John, you come in first.
If I may, Aled, I had a quick look at this earlier. I haven't had long to look at these papers. I didn't know I was coming till sort of 9 o'clock this morning. But looking at it, the proportion of the revenue budget, which is going to be taken up by financing costs, is actually going to fall We were getting very excited about it a couple of years ago because we thought it was sort of going to get past 6% on the way towards 8%, and be totally unaffordable. What's happening is that the inflation helps enormously. Because once you start increasing your budget, then the proportion that's there for financing costs, which are relatively stable, tends to decline. So looking at the numbers, I think Jane will probably agree with me. I think it peaks somewhere a little bit over 4% and then drops back to around about 4%, and that's I mean totally acceptable. The other thing which of course was helping it is the slow progress, and I do mean this, awfully slow progress on the capital projects themselves.
Yes, thank you, John. No, that's a story in itself, isn't it, really? But
Yeah. Could I make one other point too? We haven't touched on capital receipts in the meeting. It might be worth doing that, Aled.
Well, good point. Do you want to address Jane, David? Do you want to address John's points there? What is the actual cost in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence of the capital programme year on year? Because there have been changes to the MRP to sort of smooth out the payments and things over the lifetime of the investments. I'm sorry, Jane, your hand's up.
Yeah, it was just, I think John's quoted the figures. They're there. If you look at the ratio of financing cost and net revenue stream, which are on page 24 of the capital strategy. Sorry, I've got a different set of papers up rather than the same as you. But the table there shows financing costs ranging, starting at 11.35 million and rising to 14.89 million over the next 5 years. And as John rightly says, they start, the current year is around 3.8. They do rise over the next couple of years up to 4.3, but then drop back down to 4% by 27, 28. So that's that's for the general fund individually on its own, and obviously the HRA is different, and those are much higher, but again they're totally financed by the HRA. There's a business
financing,
case.
Isn't it?
Yeah, there's a business case for each individual house that we build to make sure that it's affordable and the payback period is appropriate, much the same as we do with our capital projects as they become introduced into the capital scheme. We've got quite a robust business case framework now in place to ensure that we can look at that. So yeah, based on that at the moment, things change as we've seen over the last few years in terms of our future settlements. All of that has to be considered when you consider whether your capital programme is affordable going into the future. But based on what we currently know, then there are no concerns.
Good. So no excuse for not having a radical school transformation programme. Sorry, I'm not putting your words in your mouth, Jane, but I won't expect you to answer that. David, did you want to comment on the capital programme at all? And I do want to come back to John's point around sales, basically, and also that funding from most governments is such a low proportion of it towards Powys. If you could explain that as well, Jane. Before Jane does that, any comment from you, David?
Just to say that the capital programme will have to be monitored very, very, very closely, obviously, because the increase in interest rates, etc., going forward. And generally speaking, as inflation will start to come down, initially we'll see a significant increase again in interest rates, but eventually it'll all balance out. But as far as the programme's concerned, I'm all for an increase in the speed of development around transformational projects. But it will have to be managed very, very closely, needless to say, because of the potential impact on the revenue budget. But I'm fairly confident going forward that we can deliver.
Okay, thank you, David. John, on the sales or
I was just
capital
looking,
receipts.
I was just looking. I've got it on page. Hang on.
38.
There we are. Yeah, page 38, big page 176, I think. I'm looking there at the capital receipts. I seem to remember, Jane, that we were talking really over the last few years around about the 2 million mark for capital receipts being spent each year. It's encouraging to see that it's doubled, but I was hoping for a considerably greater increase than that, and I think perhaps you were.
I think at the moment, in terms of the plan, we're recognising that there are more receipts becoming available. They've been built into the plan on 4.2 million per year, but that will very much be driven through the asset review. So although some work has been done around that and we've started to look at that, it isn't final yet. So we'll have to see where that takes us over the longer period. So the indicative figures that we've built in there at the moment see a higher level of receipt, but I would doubt that's the final figure that we see. But there's still some work to go to understand that fully.
We can look forward to seeing this asset review soon, can we?
Yeah, I think it's been shared through some of the committees, isn't it, in terms of the progress made to date. But as I said, it's not complete as yet. And that's not been shared, you know, the completeness of it hasn't been shared with Cabinet yet either, as to where it's got to.
Okay.
There's an update report coming to governance and audit next week.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I've heard that line before sometime, Jane. I'm not quite complete, but it's a long awaited, isn't it, really? And it's a basis of we have to get it right before we can move forward. Thank you. Just going back to that funding from Welsh Government, can you explain? I was trying to scroll back to the right page.
This is around the capital, isn't it? I think basically, I think Welsh Government had higher expectations in terms of their capital allocations. So I think that the funding that they've had delivered to them wasn't what they expected. So the overall level of the Welsh Government capital budget has been is lower than they expected, and hence obviously then what's available to local authorities has been retained at that lower, well, not the lower level, but at the 22-23 level, with very little increase due to where they see themselves.
Yes, but paragraph 317 talks about the budget being 180 million, an increase of 30 million on a Wales basis, isn't it?
Yes. And
so,
again, some of that is specific. I think there's talk there as well that 20 million of that is what they're holding separately to support their Net Zero Wales plan. So although there's some extra, it doesn't necessarily all flow through the settlement, and that's why we're not seeing the increase that we're seeing.
Okay. But in the 3.18, you know, powers should be getting roughly 4 or 5% of the total allocation if it's on a head basis.
Yeah, I think all authorities have seen, you know, only small increases at this stage. I haven't got that here to hand, but you know, I don't think we've been treated differently to anybody. That's just in terms of the allocation nationally.
Yeah, when I see 113k there.
We're yet to see, of course, how much we may be able to pull down through those specific grants as well.
Okay. And yeah. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done in that area.
Yeah.
Which is a bit frustrating when setting budgets, but anyway.
It's the routine that we've seen year on year, isn't it?
I know. Okay. Right. Thanks. Any other comments on the capital budget from panel members or guests as well, Lynn and Gareth? No. We have fewer. I just noticed we're really very thin on the ground now, aren't we? Are we still caught? Yes, just. Okay, diolch Wyn. Any other comments on the budget going forward from cabinet members? No, sorry, not cabinet members, members of the panel. Anita, sorry. Sorry, Anita. So is it just me, or is everybody struggling to hear you?
No.
Sorry, Anita, we just cannot hear anything you're saying.
No.
Oh dear.
Is there any way of communicating with Anita?
Can try and drop a message in the chat, Chair.
Oh, diolch.
Oh, I think she's gone altogether.
Okay. Yeah, and apologies, I didn't pick up Arwel's message about having to go to governors at 4 o'clock. Jeremy, I could see you popping up then. Your thoughts on the budget?
Having a lot of problems with my internet, and my laptop keeps itching into the school one next door, and then it just cuts everything out. I've been here for hours trying to get in. The thing is driving me mad. Basically, listening to today, and I think it's been quite a useful debate, listening to yourself, Alan, asking the questions, and it's helped us to understand things a little bit better. And I'm just going to say to Jane, just to get a little bit of understanding. So it seems to me, if putting this in layperson's terms, that the schools had a very good lump sum sent to them at the end of last term. The council now is in unprecedented times with inflation running at 10%, and with all the stuff that's gone on out of the blue, which is uncontrollable, and with the increase in fuel costs and electricity and everything, etc. So it seems to me that we're trying to get a budget which is to get us through for the next 12 months to really have a better understanding of where we're going to be following that. Would I be, in lay terms, would that sort of catch up where we are?
I think, and apologies if this doesn't answer you exactly, but I'll do my best. I think what you're seeing before you is a budget proposal that looks to produce a balanced budget for 23-24. It doesn't address the longer term situation now immediately, but it does put us in a position where we can start to develop that now quickly, so that we can react to it in 24-25. So there are some elements within the budget plan that buy a little time to enable us to do that, but the majority of the pressures and the majority of the commitments being looked at are funded within this base budget going forward. So there are some things that need to be developed further before we set that budget for the following year. I hope that sort of addresses what you're looking for.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of unknowns at the moment, so it's very difficult to predict where we're going. And basically, we're all paddling water in business, and this is what we're talking about today, is till we understand fully the direction of where we're going. I'm going to come back to one of my things. I keep saying that we're going to start to have services which are untenable soon. And I still think they need to be identified so that we can't just keep cutting. You know, we've seen the damage of cutting from before. I've asked the cabinet to look at set up to look at a 3-year program going back over the cuts of the last 3 years, so we can assess how the cuts have made and what the impact has been on the council, because I don't always think we understand the cuts of what have gone on previous, what effects they have they worked, or is it that by cutting them that other things have actually cost us more in the end? And the one question to go with schools was that if we do end up having to downscale the numbers of people employed at the schools, is there an impact that would roughly have an idea of what the cost of going through all the what would I say, paying redundancy to these
Redundancies.
people, and
Restructure.
how much that redundancy could be, because that then is a pressure or a, whatever you want to call it, against what the saving is. It's just one thing I'd like to understand there. But I understand the predicament at the moment, because there's so many things up in the air, and it's very difficult to put your finger on where we're going. So that would be my thing with it. I'm just trying to understand with a budget is what our intention is, and that's what I seem to be got from today is we're trying to get a balanced budget to get us through for the next 12 months. So hopefully inflation is stabilizing, the costs of all our fuels, costs of all our electricity stabilizes, and then we can have a bit more of a balanced ground to see where we're going forward. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the input. Jane or David, would you want to comment on that? You do say by a little time, but it also puts in additional pressures as well, doesn't it, this budget, on the following year's budget?
I don't think it puts necessarily additional pressure. It just doesn't finalize some of those pressures on a permanent basis. It buys a little time, doesn't it? It manages them, but doesn't completely remove them or resolve them on a permanent basis. But I think that's limited in terms of your overall budget position. And I'm not going to reopen the debate that we've had, but we've sort of teased that out. I think just in response to Councillor Jeremy, in terms of any redundancies, I mean, any redundancy that is proposed has to be accompanied by a business case in terms of the level of payment that may be eligible by that member of staff. That has to be something that's factored in. And we do hold within the overall risk budget for the council, we hold provision to meet redundancy costs, so that doesn't have to be borne by the service that's making those reductions, and the saving is released immediately at a service level. So we do hold that funding as well to help us manage through that.
And that's right across the council.
Yes.
Can I just comment on what Councillor Jeremy said there? Because in fact, the way he outlined that, I'm very pleased that he's actually picked up and understood the very rationale behind this budget that I've been outlining for some time now. So thank you for that, Jeremy. But the one thing I will say with regard to some of the comments around this budget and the fact that we haven't been able to fund all the pressures developing within services. Well, I don't want to go into detail now, but the alternatives of what we've done are quite frightening. And that goes without saying.
Okay. Okay. I won't reopen that debate. We could go around in circles again on that. But all pressures are within most services have been reconciled in some way or not. But I wouldn't say that, but schools have. However, committee members, any other comments? Or any other areas of Gareth? We've only just skimmed on the budget, to be honest, Andre. Gareth.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to build on this rationale that Councillors Jeremy and David have just reinforced, is I've been taken in reading through all the documentation about the rigor that's gone into this to make these difficult decisions, and hopefully that they've been made in an informed way. There's a lot of work being gone on right throughout the council amongst officers to put this all together. And I'm thinking about what lessons we can learn in looking at future budgets. And one of the things that I was very taken by was the impact assessment of cuts in the budget and the methodology that was adopted to make these in arriving at these decisions. So I've seen an awful lot of documentation about what the council's not going to do. What I would suggest is that methodology through the business planning process for the integrated budgets looked at the effectiveness and efficiency of what the council is going to do and have a set of performance indicators and output levels to trace. What I don't see is a link back from this budget to the high level, what the budget contributes to meeting the high level objectives of the council. And I think we would all as a panel would look forward to a briefing in due course on the reimagining Powys, because I believe the objectivity that's been brought to this process, particularly around the cuts, combining that with what Councillor David said about public consultation on what the priorities are for the people of the county who the services have been delivered for, is going forward, is that we've got a budget that aligns with the objectives and has got the outcomes which contribute to those high level, those outputs which contribute to those high level outcomes. In industry, they say, if you can't measure something, you don't get any budget to do it. So there's something around here in this reimagining process is the bangs for bucks and doing the right thing, and in doing those right things for service delivery, do them in the most efficient manner and delivering the best value for money and in the most appropriate way.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gareth, and making those changes as soon as possible as well. And it's important. Speed within that process is hugely important because we just don't have the time on our sides, really. Oh, sorry, Gareth, did you want to come back in?
No, it's just I think we got a platform here that a positive platform that can be used very beneficially.
Yeah, can I just comment? Chair?
Yeah, go on, David.
I think at the start of this whole process, Gareth, it started with Cabinet reviewing the integrated business plans coming from all the services, and they were very ambitious. The credit to the heads of service, etc. But what did become very, very apparent was that all the pressures developing within those plans, we wouldn't be able to fund them all from the existing financial envelope. So we had to make adjustments accordingly. But there's another saying in business, isn't there? You know, failure to plan is planning to fail. And the plan this year was obviously just to stabilize the authority's budget during this period of severe financial crisis. And I think we managed to do that. And I think we have got a platform to go forward. It does put us on a sound base to actually go ahead with the reimagining Powys. And once that plan is finalized, I'm sure we'd all be too happy to share that with Finance Panel. But it's in its early stages. Well, I say early stages, it's fairly well developed, but it isn't quite there yet. But when it is ready, I'm sure, and I've made a commitment anyway, that as Cabinet member for corporate transformation, that we do consult on that plan and we do share it with councillors as soon as possible, because it's absolutely essential that we get stakeholder buy-in at all levels to that plan, because there is significant change proposed, but it's essential change as well.
No, thank you.
No, thank you, David. But it does give a real difficulty with this budget. If we could have seen that before this budget proposals, it would give you council much more confidence in going forward. But I know as ever, everybody's always up against it to some degree. Jane.
Just to add to that, really, and I'm not sure, Gareth, where you've necessarily seen some of this information, but across the council, we do pull together a quarterly monitoring report that reviews performance, and that report, at the outset each year, a number of measures and objectives are set, and then for each service level, and they can be quite detailed at a service level, but those are monitored then to see how services have delivered against those. So you will see that forthcoming for the new year as well, but we're currently, all of that is in place. It's just about then finalise the population of what is measured through the year in line with the corporate plan. So you will see that coming forward, although there is some further work, and I know you've seen some of what we've already done in developing benchmarking and other things to aid the scrutiny process. There is some work to be done there to improve that further, so that scrutiny gets a much broader suite of information to enable you to fulfil that role.
Well, look forward to that.
You've been promising benchmarking for years, Jane.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there.
Matthew.
Thanks, Chair. I think it is important that we link the wider council into the Reimagining Powers work that has begun, and it's good to hear that members of this committee are interested in following some of that, and happy to come back and you know, discuss that with you. But Chair, you will have been briefed on the Reimagining Powers work as a group leader. I was at the same meeting where some of the Power BI stuff was presented, so you have got a bit of a head start on others, which will be useful background, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yes, a very sort of skeletal snapshot, but wait to see more flesh on those branches. Mixing everything up, aren't I? Sorry, apologies. Any other comments from committee members? Just one final one. I am concerned about the risk within this budget, especially in well, schools stands out a mile, and there's one or two risky things around adult services about having to have that cooperation of third parties in delivering some of those savings. Clearly, can't go into detail on those, but as a Section 151 officer, do you see this as a I don't know how many budgets you've done now as 151 officer, Jane. How does this rank? Is it does it feel manageable risks within this? I'm just taking your view as your experience and seeking your advice on that about the risk contained within this budget and how manageable it is going forward.
I think when you step into this role, any budget looks like a risky budget when you start fulfilling this role. But and every year we've commented, or I've commented on the level of risk in a budget. I think the level of risk this time is heightened, and I think that's set out in my my assessment at the end of the budget report. You know, with the level of inflation that we're seeing and the uncertainty that we've seen over the last 12 months now, isn't it? You know, that does increase the level of risk, and that's why in terms of this budget, the development of it, the robustness of the estimates, the level to which we can afford to fund pressures or not, and the level of risk that we still carry as a result of that, all of that has been factored into my assessment, along with the level of reserves that we hold and the ongoing revenue risk budget. And that's why, on my advice, Cabinet have proposed to increase that. I think that's recognising the level of risk in here, and I would say that level of risk is the highest I've seen it in the short term that I've been a Section 151 officer. I think this is the third budget I've done. I'm not sure. It's either the third or the fourth. So it's robust enough in terms of the level of risk that we see.
I'll ask you to reflect in 10 budgets time about this budget looking backwards. But you do say there's a heightened level of risk remains within this budget, and yet our reserves are at the lower end of acceptability.
And they have been for some time.
Yes. So you have put aside certain reserves to balance off some of the risks. How much have they been increased by this year?
It's a set in the overall level of risk and the level of reserve. So we know in terms of our general fund and our budget management reserve, there was an expectation that we would have to draw on those reserves this year. We think that has now diminished. We've got a Q3 report that will currently be shared with everybody that does show an even further improvement in our financial position going forward, which does limit the use of those reserves. I think at the end of last year, when we were able to increase our reserves quite substantially due to the extra funding that we saw coming through, and we have called on that to manage costs this year, and we'll continue to call on that to some degree next year in terms of those specific reserves. They were set aside for that purpose. But I'm really pleased to see that we're not having to draw on the general fund to support either this year's budget or the budget being set, and that is vital to maintain that level of reserves. We're not increasing reserves within this budget plan. You know, that's not appropriate, I don't think, when we're asking council taxpayers to support that with higher levels of council tax if we were to do that. So I think it's, you know, the process that we have in place for monitoring our budget, the action that we put in place when we have to deal with things that come across the way. We've proved over the last 3 years that we can do that, you know, both through COVID and both through this financial year, and that sets us in a good place in terms of those processes going forward to be able to manage whatever comes our way.
Thank you, Jane. And to Councillor David and Matthew, are you promising that there will be no knee-jerk reactions in the next financial year? For example, the leisure centres issue before Christmas.
Can I just pick up on this concern over reserves? I certainly wouldn't underestimate the need to have reserves. Far from it, is essential. But when you're talking about risk, I can't, you know, I've been handling budgets all my working life, and I can't remember a budget without having some element of risk in it. But what's important is the fact that risk, a good manager, a good financial manager, mitigates risks and manages them. And you don't have to worry about the need for reserves then. I think it's just worth bearing that in mind, because sometimes we overemphasize the nature of reserves, and that distracts then from the need to manage risk. And that's what's key to any budget. It's the management of risk. And I see no need for any knee-jerk reactions in the future. It's unfortunate, I agree with you there, that what did happen prior to Christmas over the leisure centres. But no, I don't see, I think we're in a position now where we can plan our way forward. There are roadmaps developing, and I really don't see the need for any knee-jerk reaction.
Thank you, David. Matthew, I don't know whether you want to add to that. You had to turn your camera on.
No, there's nothing further to add, Chair. None of us want to put communities through the stress and pain of losing services or any uncertainty. We want to be as clear as we can with people and align our resources to ensure that we can deliver good quality local services for the people of Powys. We will, however, need to respond to the changing economic situation. That's inevitable, but we will do our best to be upfront and honest with people about that.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, David. Panel, any other questions? And that, when I say panel, I include Lynn and John as well. No. Right. We should make a couple of recommendations. Sorry, Lynn. Hello. Did you want to make
No, I'm fine. Thank you very much, Chair.
No, okay. And I'm not sure if how many of the other members are actually here as well. John, good to see you. I you know, clearly you know I'm concerned, particularly around schools and the level of risk that contains. That's not shared by Councillor David and Matthew. I think the level of risk is too great for the schools, which have been through really difficult times. And well, you can see with teachers taking action today I'm not sure if that's happening in Powys or not. Matthew, I don't know whether you can, clearly they're not protesting outside County Hall, otherwise you wouldn't cross the picket line. But
No, Chair, I wouldn't cross a picket line. That's a personal stance for myself. But the National Education Union are taking industrial action in Powys today, unfortunately. But what would be useful perhaps for Cabinet to hear from your reflections, Chair, if I may be so bold, is to consider, your concerns about risk. How would you fund schools differently to enable us to deliver what we need to for schools would be really useful for us to understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I'll probably jot stuff down on paper, and Wyn and I can pull something together, because I'm not sure how many of the finance panel are left here, to be honest. So it would be unfair of me to dominate that discussion by being the only one here. Well, it's me and Gareth at the moment, and Jeremy as well.
Just to give you a heads up, Chair, I have to make all recommendations available to the Cabinet by tomorrow morning.
Oh,
so we're on
okay.
A pretty short timeline here.
Okay. Can we quick discussion afterwards? And we're in.
Yeah, of course.
Right, thank you all. And I can see Emma Palmer has. Have you been there all the time, Emma, or not? It's
no, I haven't, Chair. I've been getting on with other work and
okay.
Was viewing and brought in. So
okay.
I don't know if there's anything I can add at this late point. But
no problem at all. Okay, thanks all. Thanks officers. Thanks for the audit committee members as well, John and Lynn, for coming along as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair.
Diolch pawb.
Cheers, Aled.
Bye.